of you, work with the pressures for ethno-nationalism that always are pressures exerted on women, and as well as on men. And oftentimes they're very rewarding. I mean, many women have come to political activism through nationalism, right? Now, once they become active in nationalist movements or anti-colonial movements or anti-military movements, oftentimes they discover what patriarchy looks like inside their anti-militarist or anti-colonial movements. And so there's a new consciousness that comes out of that, and it's not surprising that out of many nationalist movements come feminist movements, not because they're indebted to the nationalist movements, but they discover what patriarchy looks like inside an allegedly progressive movement. So it is absolutely true, you're absolutely right, that, that many women, two things, that many women find reward in becoming politically energized by nationalist / ethno-nationalist movements. On the other hand, it's also true that nationalist and ethno-nationalist movements have their male leaderships, and they're overwhelmingly male leaderships, put enormous pressures on women as mothers, wives, and daughters to support those movements so that they can be portrayed as really backed by families and backed by communities. It's really very, very tricky. And the amount of writing that has been writing, and I'm talking about, again, as if writing matters, right? That the amount of writing and speaking that have been done by feminists in countries like South Korea, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in the former Yugoslavia, about the pitfalls of nationalist mobilization of women, those pitfalls for women, are an enormous resource. It is something that in the last 20 and 25 years has made us much smarter about how women get mobilized into otherwise patriarchal movements that look as though they are progressive. And unfortunately, a lot of their progressive allies around the world have no feminist consciousness at all, and therefore do not really ask the questions they need to ask about which kinds of ethno-nationalist and or nationalist movements are they supporting without any conditions being put on them to be less patriarchal. So virtually all I have learned from feminists who have critiqued without becoming, they have critiqued ethno-nationalism from the inside, not for the sake of strengthening post-neo-colonial projects, but for the sake of really strengthening a more genuine notion of, quote, the nation.
I would just add to that comment that I think you're right, that there has been tremendous learning over recent decades that when those nationalist movements peak, achieve their objectives, that's when women are most vulnerable and often are then disempowered and sent back home because the ends have been met. And if you look at the experience of women, say in the ANC in South Africa, as they approached their liberation goals, the women were pretty smart and got the men to agree that the women would get a third of ANC representation. So that is why women today in South Africa have one of the highest political representations in the world. I mean, we all know the story of Rwanda also, but it was actually, that I think is quite different. But what happened in South Africa was a realization that when they look around the world at similar liberation movements, that the women really have failed to translate that into their own goals. So I think there is a slow but steady learning curve that is going on and being shared, and the internet and transnational movements are helping take lessons learned from one context and apply them in another.
And they're not filtered through the United States. I mean, it was the Zimbabwean women who really who tutored the South African women and said, we made the mistake in Zimbabwe. here's what our mistake was, don't you make this mistake, right? And it's Cuban women who literally talked to the Nicaraguan women and said, we made this mistake, don't you make this mistake. And the Algerian women have been talking to the Palestinian women and said, we made this mistake at a very particular juncture, you don't have to make that mistake. So a lot of the learning is without being filtered through Stockholm or Berlin or New York. And that's really very powerful.
Shama, do you have a question back